Welcome to the Salient podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
On the Salient podcast today, we journey into the world of mapping and explore the role of feedback and feedforward in navigating complexity. I'm joined by Marcus Guest. Marcus is originally from the UK and is one of a small number of people actively developing adaptive strategy using Wardley maps. What's interesting about Marcus is his solid grounding in the science of complex adaptive systems. In a past life, Marcus worked in organizations in Europe and Asia, overseeing rapid expansion of operations and as a strategy director in a leading consulting firm. In addition to the competitive use of Wardley maps, Marcus has a unique perspective on Eastern and Western approaches to strategy and complexity. Amongst all of these broad experiences, I want to challenge myself in today's interview to really zero in on the role of feedback and feed forward within a mapping and adaptive strategy approach in business. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you, Ian. Good to be here.
Before we get going into the broad of Wardley mapping and adaptive strategy and feedback and feed forward, I want you to go back. I ask this question a lot because often there's an antecedent, there's something that happened in childhood, there's something happened in education. It could be anything anywhere in your past that predisposed you to a future as a consultant providing adaptive strategy. Tell us a little bit about the young Marcus. Is there anything there that, I mean, if you're like me, you certainly didn't wake up at the age of 5 and go, well, I'm going to be a trainer or a consultant or work with adaptive strategy. You know, what sort of predispose you to be where you are now, doing what you do now?
I think I always had a desire to get out and see the world. I think that was something that was burning within me from quite a young age, and which is exactly what I did as soon as I graduated. I think I spent the next 6 or 7 years traveling. Now, you need to pay for that traveling, so I was a little bit entrepreneurial at certain times. I used to import incense from India for resale in Britain, and that funded my journeys going a little bit further. I fell into opening up a language school in Central Asia in the late 90s. So I think from an early age, because I wanted to get out there and see the world, I was doing what I needed to do to fulfill that passion. And by the time I'd opened up, and I was in my mid-20s then, my own business, from which I then got headhunted by the world's leading private education firm, and that started me in my career. But started me in my career at a reasonably high level. I was a country director in Southeast Asia for this Scandinavian multinational. We were headquartered in Shanghai, but I was a country director in Southeast Asia by the age of 29, because that was the strategy of that organization, was to try to pick up what they thought were tomorrow's talents at today's prices, which is a fairly good strategy to actually have if you can pick talent. So I think by that stage, yeah, I was doing what I needed to do to keep moving around the world, and then finally I landed somewhere, and with the support structures to then start my business. So I would say I fell into it because I was avoiding going into an ordinary job, and I just wanted to see what the world was like. And so you adapt, you do what you need to do to keep going and to get the next flight and to go into the next place. So probably I fell into it would be the right way of doing it.
Well, you say that. Let me ask you another challenging question. At a very young age, this organization identified that you were tomorrow's talent. What do you think they saw or heard that went, oh, this guy, let's back him?
Well, what they did is that they brought me to Moscow just after the 98 crisis. Their business had struggled because the 98 crisis was huge, and anybody living in Asia will remember that crisis. And I was part of a team of international people looking to re-establish the business after that crisis. And the way they ran it was the president and the vice president, who were both Swedish but based in Shanghai, was that they would travel around the world to each country where they had operations and do the budgets once a year. And that was normally a process of because I then became a country director and they did it when I was in Thailand. It was normally a question of turning up for a week and going through the budgets and going through the ideas that the person running those language centers had going forward. And one of the language centers I had been brought in to manage, I was managing two of them, was under pressure. It was a small language center. It was on the outskirts of the city, and they really wanted to close it down. And I put forward a very impassioned defense of about how I felt that the strength was the people in the organization, how we'd looked at the potential growth in that area, the fact that public transport was being invested in. And it was as they later told me, it was the impassioned way that you defended and fought back against our willingness or our desire to close it that made us feel, okay, here's somebody who believes in what he's saying. Here's somebody who can put a defense forward for what he's saying. And when an opportunity arose at the end of my contract, because it was a 2-year contract, it was me that was one of the people shortlisted for Thailand, which sounded wonderful, sounded exotic, especially after living for 2 years in Russia, where it was a bit of a poison chalice they were handing me. But that impassioned nature was what I needed when I got there, because I was walking into a bit of a bear pit and it needed sorting out. So it wasn't perhaps so much they saw me as a great talent, but they saw me as somebody who could deal with a problem that they actually had, which I managed to do. So they were correct in that. And the level of training and the level of operations, the processes that take place in a successful multinational, it's a great learning curve. So the 4 years I spent in that organization was after being an entrepreneur, going around India and Central Asia and Siberia. It was a great learning curve. So it was a good symbiotic relationship.
Yeah. Again, in so many of these interviews, I pay attention to the unconscious, the things that we say, like, I just fell into it, really. And then as we start to unpack some of the attributes of how come you were identified, you just described some analysis that you did, even as a young person, looking at this language center that was struggling to perform. And what, in addition to the impassioned nature of your argument, your defense, I noticed that you talked about the quality of the people, you talked about the budget, and you also talked about the investment in infrastructure and transport. So there's an analysis there that goes with the judgment and the impassioned defense. So I'm just drawing attention to that, of course, because today's conversation is about feedback and it's about feed forward. And at the heart of that is knowing, where are you right now? What's your situation? What's your situational assessment? Where am I? On which directions am I going to go? Which directions am I going to back? And which ones am I perhaps not going to do that? Which brings me back to this idea of Wardley maps. Can you briefly describe what is a Wardley map?
Okay, in the briefest possible way, as somebody said to me, it's circles and squiggly lines on a page. And that's what I think a lot of people see when they hear of Wardley maps, or if they search for it online, they get these images of circles and squiggly lines on a map. But Wardley maps, there's a lot more to it. So the map itself is a way of visually representing a landscape. So the situation that you're in, and that can be any situation. It can be a problem that you're dealing with at work. It can be the entire organization. It could be the marketplace that you're in. It could even be the global economy, if you really wanted to try and map something that large. But what you do with a Wardley map is that, and I think this is the most fundamental part of it, you start with a user and that user's need. And that user is often best if it's not your own need. That user should be somebody who's important to the survival or thriving of your organization. So that's often going to be a customer, or it could be shareholders, it could be employees, it could be regulators. So that's what you start. That's your North Star. That gives you a focus. And in my experience, that's probably the single biggest mistake organizations make, is that they focus on their own needs. They don't focus on the needs of those they need to satisfy. So even just that step, which is who's your user, is quite revolutionary for most organizations, because they're used to thinking about themselves. They're used to thinking about internal power structures, the budgets that they need to get for their departments. And once you have that user, then you need to understand what that user needs. Now, within Wardley mapping, that's often a given, because Wardley mapping comes out of the IT community, a little bit like Agile came out of the IT community and have spread into the other side of the business, into the rest of the business. I think Wardley Maps is taking a similar journey. And one of my criticisms, perhaps, of Wardley Maps is that, as I said, the user need is a given. The user needs this function. The user needs this button. But for those of us who don't work in IT, you know that understanding user needs is kind of the holy grail. It's really difficult to actually do. So we take a few different approaches to doing that. We start with understanding what users want, because wants tend to be a little bit more permanent. For example, I want to get fit and healthy is a want probably that we all have in January every year. But what we need to do will be different perhaps each year. Perhaps as we get older, we don't want to be so much going out and doing a lot of exercise. We may start looking at our diet. We may start looking at other things. So what you need and what you want are different things. But once you've got what you need, then you understand, well, okay, if that's what you need, what does that need? And that, in terms of what kind of activities or what kind of practices or what kind of data or knowledge is required. And then what does that need? And what does that need? And what you're left with is a chain of needs. So in order for this user to get this, they need this, that needs that needs this needs that. And then you just got this list, a chain. But the value in a Wardley map is the x-axis, which is the evolution axis. And this is the real genius of Simon Wardley's work, is figuring out this evolution of components. So everything we do and how we do it is evolving. And it's evolving from something that was once completely new, novel, uncertain, risky, exciting, a potential source of value. But because it's uncertain, most people really don't know whether it's going to survive or not. But if you then find demand for what you're doing, the thing will evolve. And as it evolves, it becomes more certain, it becomes more stable, more known, it's measurable. It then becomes potentially a cost of doing business. So it's a low margin activity, but because it's a cost of doing business, you can have volume operations. So everything you're doing and how you're doing it is at different stages of evolution. So you can't treat something which is completely uncertain and might fail the same way as something which is highly certain and critical, a critical component in a supply chain or an infrastructure or a value chain. And so this is just a visual representation on a map of everything that you are doing to satisfy that user need. And at its most basic, I would say it's a communication tool, because once you've got that map, most of us use maps on a daily basis. So once you put that map up and you spend a couple of minutes explaining to somebody the logic behind it, they can see everything that's on there. They can see your assumptions and they can challenge it. They can say, but why do we have that there? Are we missing this component? Do we have that in the wrong place? And then it becomes a communication tool for which people can actually then start to figure things out for themselves. But even saying that, that's just one of 4 key parts of Wardley mapping. And that's, I think, the part that most people who have a past and familiarity with maps, they will know the map itself. But there's an awful lot of other stuff behind it, which is really quite deep. It's a brilliant piece of work that Simon's done. So, for example, once you have a map, then there are 30 economic models that you can apply to the map to anticipate how things are going to evolve in the future. So these are economic models such as the Red Queen effect from Van Valen, the fact that you have to keep moving just to keep up with everybody else. This will be creative destruction from Joseph Schumpeter. It'll be the innovation paradox from Innovation Paradox story, Salomon's story, which is that you have to deal with the things on the left of the map, which are highly uncertain, at the same time as dealing with the things on the right of the map. So if you're in organizations, you've probably had those conversations of people who say, well, we're dealing with the business of today and they're dealing with the business of tomorrow. And these two are kind of become rival factions in an organization, because the people dealing with the business of today think those who are focused on the business of tomorrow are wasting resources. They got flaky ideas and they can't be trusted. While those people think of the business of tomorrow, look at the people dealing with the business of today and thinking, oh, they're conservative and boring and they're unimaginative. So you have to manage both of these extremes and also what's going on in the middle. And so the economic models give you a sense of how that's anticipating, but there's also other things in there, such as the principles or the basic ways of operating or behaving in an organization, which are mostly common sense, but common sense isn't that widespread as we know in organizations. So that gives you an understanding of how to actually adapt, to develop your ability to adapt. So if Wardley maps are good for understanding the kind of how things are evolving and the kind of moves you can make strategically, then the principles are a way of developing at the same time your ability to execute and your ability to implement what's going on. So in short, the mapping, yes, is the map itself, but there's an awful lot behind it that answers that question when they see a map is, well, what is it telling me? What do I do with this map? Well, that's the other stages, and people often miss those stages out. And they say, I didn't really understand the squiggly lines and the circles, don't really get it. Well, that's because there's a whole bunch of other work behind it, which helps you kind of guides you through what do you now do with the map. But as I said, at its most basic, it's a communication tool that gets people literally on the same page. And even just from that perspective, it's extremely valuable. But there's a lot more to it once you go into it in a bit more depth.
Thanks for the description there, and I think I've learned a few things already about Wardley maps, and I've been dipping my toe into Wardley mapping for a long time, and I've not really immersed myself in that way. Well, one of the things I think was super important that I took there was holding, I call it a duality, but I think it might be more of a spectrum of this relationship between business as usual and tomorrow, the future, the transformation. I'd say that most agencies, I'm scanning for exceptions at the moment, and I don't really have any. Most agencies that I'm working with, the closest metaphor I've got has come from the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia, and I worked with those folks many years ago, and their metaphor was, it's like we've launched the plane and we're flying it, and we're trying to change out the engines without landing. And I just thought it was such a fantastic metaphor because they can't stop. You can't just pull the pin on it and say, oh, hang on a minute, we need a reset. But there's some substantial changes that need to happen. And changing the engines out, you can't afford to crash. You can't afford to stop the plane. And I think most agencies seem to have a bit of that going on. They have to keep the lights on and keep doing business as usual. And they know that they need to adapt and change simultaneously. What is there? Just thinking of that pattern, is that something that you can immediately see in a Wardley map? You look at it and you go, "Oh, I can see what's going on here. We've got to have that BAU running here, and we've got the transformation piece here." That's what I see in the map. And does that provide guidance on how to manage those teams and those relationships across those boundaries?
It does, but I think it does something before that as well. Just the sheer act of making the map, because you don't want to make a map on your own. You really want to have other people with different perspectives coming together. That's our user, that's the need, or that's the problem that we're trying to address. This is who will benefit most from us solving that. That's what these people want. These are their needs. And then once you start to map that out, you're having those conversations where people are saying, well, we need this, which someone from a different function or different team or in a different country will say, well, why do you actually need that? That process of understanding what the other departments need and having it in a language that you understand. It's not having a spreadsheet to try and understand something, because that privileges finance and it might not necessarily privilege HR. You don't want to have a system diagram because, again, it privileges IT, but then again, doesn't necessarily privilege the marketing team. But we all use maps on a daily basis. So it's something that is, let's say it's the second language everybody has in an organization, because finance has spreadsheets. But when they're going to and from a meeting in different parts of the city, they'll get out their phone and they'll look on a map how they actually get there. So everybody's has a familiarity with maps. So when you're creating that map together, you're already learning and seeing the situation from others' perspectives, and that gives you a better understanding not only of what the situation is, but the challenges that other people are actually facing. and an appreciation of the work that others need to get done. And the fact that satisfying this user need isn't just a simple ABC, but there's an awful lot of, the legs of the swan is furiously under the water, pushing the rest of the birds. So you get an appreciation of that. But yes, once you have that map, it's also then very useful that you can start to show it to other people who have not been part of that process. And they will look at it with fresh eyes and challenge it again and say why you're missing this. You can show it to people who are subject matter experts, who will actually give you a little bit more depth in parts of those areas of the map that are important to you. But once you have that map, once you are satisfied that the map is a reasonable representation of your current state, and it's always the current state you want to start mapping first. You need to understand where you are first. Once you've got that reasonable representation of the current state, the map instantly shows you for the evolution axis, well, what types of methods you should be using. So you do want to be using agile type methods on the left-hand side of the map, because your focus here is on reducing the cost of change. You're going to be doing things fast, failing early, and learning. But you don't want to be using agile on the right-hand side of the map, where it might be a critical system that you really don't need that system to go down, because there's going to be an awful lot of people depending on it. So there you're going to use a different type of method, or you may outsource that to experts. Now, for example, your electricity system, you're not going to run your own electricity system with agile methods. You're going to outsource it to providers because they do it cheap and you can just pay for what you use. And again, in the middle of the map, you may use lean methods, because here you're focusing on improving things and learning as you go. So one is that you can start to see the methods. You can start to see how you would invest in that. Things on the left-hand side of the map, you wouldn't make large investments. You'd make small bets, perhaps taking a venture capital approach, or you start to pay for by outcomes only. So if you achieve this, it will unlock the next stage of funding. Whereas on the right-hand side, as I said, you want to be paying for what you get for what you use. And in the middle of the map, again, you would be buying things commercially off the shelf as products. You don't need to build your own databases, because you can just probably buy a database or even outsource a database. But it also tells you what kind of people, this is important, what kind of people and what kind of teams do you want working at different parts of the organization. Too often, I think we have, it's not too often, it's pretty much everywhere, but I think it's quite fixed that we have functional organizations. So all the IT people gather in one place, all the finance people gather in another place. But we need IT people at different parts of the map. We need IT people to manage the large systems. We also need IT people to kind of experiment with new approaches and new ideas. So you want to understand that, you have to understand that even though it's an IT person, they can have very different attitudes towards things. There are those people who like working on uncertain, risky, flaky ideas. That's their passion and they're very good at it. And you want them working on those new ideas. But you also have those people who are the opposite, who really like to work with stable systems and they like to scale things. Those people need to be working on those components in your value chain on the right-hand side of the map that are highly certain. So it's telling you with a map not only what types of methods you're using, what types of investment you should be making, or even what types of pricing you should be offering to customers, but also how to get the best out of people by thinking not only of what kind of aptitudes they've got, this is an IT person, this is a finance person, but the attitudes as well. Where will they work best? What kind of problem solving skills do they have? Are these people the ones who like to experiment? Then these are the types of challenges that they should be taking on. Or are these type of people the ones that want just to make sure that the lights stay on? And that's where if you get people who like the adventurous, the uncertain and experimentation, and you put them to manage systems that are stable and just scalable, they're going to be pretty bored and they're going to leave. But if you put people who like those scalable systems and you ask them to try to invent something new, they're going to be intimidated and they're also going to leave. So mapping enables you very, very quickly, once you have the map, to turn around and say, left-hand side of the map, highly uncertain, these methods, these approaches, these people. Right-hand side of the map, the same. And then we have the people in the middle to manage the transition between the two. And that can be, once you have a map, and a map can take, let's say, first time you do it, an hour to create, you would probably spend a day or two go around different people, having them challenge it to improve your map. And once you've got that, literally it's like 30 minutes to turn around and say, okay, now we can see all those types of questions. What should we build? What should we buy? What should we outsource? How should we staff certain things? And I think that's even just the squiggly lines and circle stage of Wardley Maps. That's incredibly valuable, I think.
Yeah, well, as you were talking there, I was thinking about my own business, and I was thinking about some of the clients that we have. I also made a very strong connection. Something we've been doing is getting teams to consider what I'm calling their preferred habitat. I use Cynefin for this, and I say, hey, here are some different systems. We could go through the different domains of Cynefin. Not surprisingly, most people don't want to be confused in the middle. Some folks just love chaos. Some love the complexity of patterns and that ability to sort of play in that space, the probing, the experimentation. Others like the ordered nature, and some like the hyper ordered nature, the highly predictable. And I think I really took that away there about that relationship between what you're saying now about Wardley mapping and the relationship to different domains of complexity. I mean, I mentioned Cynefin, of course, there's other ways of looking at those systems. And I think this is important because I think we're starting to now get the relationship between types of feedback. You talked about people, you talked previously about a chain of needs as providing input into the creation of the map. And from there, you started to talk about the future. We make decisions about more of this, these people here, this is the direction that we're going. Can you expand on that a little bit? This is now getting to that feed forward and the future anticipation. And I've got a two-part question. One is tell me more about that, and tell me more about how you know if you're going in the right direction or if you've made an error in your mapping.
Okay, so once you've got the current state mapped out, you're answering an awful lot of questions. So go back to your original question about if you're changing the engine midair. Well, you can see what actually needs to be done. You can see what's then possible, what needs to be done, what's possible, what's the right way of approaching this. And that's dealing with your current situations. And you make the best steps that you can with the resources that you have. But now you have awareness, and this to me is the essence of what mapping gives us. It's awareness and adaptiveness. You are aware of the situation more clearly. It's something that's been, the representation of it on the map has been constructed by a team who have communicated about this more effectively themselves, so they understand each other better. And what has resulted is a clear visual of this is our best understanding of the current situation. So you have all sorts of, as I said, there's benefits to doing that in terms of the decisions that you should be making about the right types of people. But then you have to recognize that the situation is going to be evolving, because everything is evolving all the time. And it's evolving because there are other players on the market with you who are making decisions, who are influencing things. If there's a new technology that comes out that makes something that you are selling no longer relevant, then that's going to have a huge impact on your business. Equally, if somebody comes out with a new practice or a new technology or a new idea which enables you to do things better, then if you adopt that, then you're going to be more efficient or you're going to be more effective. So what you're trying to look at is how that current state is likely to change. Now, Simon Wardley, obviously the creator of Wardley Maps, he's written a couple of books, both unfinished, but the first one I think is quite a few years ago, had a wonderful title, which was The Future is Uncertain, but Not Everything is Unpredictable. And when you try to see the big picture, like what's going to be happening in the world in the next 2 years and what's going to happen in the world perhaps in the next 2 months, far too many moving parts. Really difficult to know what's going on because I think you're dealing with too big a picture. Once you start to break down that situation into that value chain, so we're trying to meet this need. Okay, you've got multiple users, they've got multiple needs, but let's just, in mind's eye, just think of one user with one need and all the things that are required to satisfy that need. Because you've broken it down to its component parts, those component parts are evolving at different rates. Some are evolving quickly, some are evolving slowly, and some are changing their their nature, because as something becomes, so on a map, there are 4 stages. We use 3 just to simplify it. And those 3 stages are something that's fluid, that's you're still figuring out. At the other extreme, there's something that's specific, it's kind of concrete. And then there's the transitional stage in between. But when it passes across those barriers, when someone moves from fluid to transitional, it moves from something that is uncertain and a little bit flaky into something that's a product or a service. That changes the nature of the thing, because people then understand it, you're selling it as a product. I think that's where the stage Wardley Maps is at. It's just turning into something that's people are making into a product now. At the other extreme, when something moves from being a product into a utility service, so let's think of the best example being perhaps data centers turning into cloud computing. That creates a whole spectrum of other opportunities that you can start to build on top of the platform. So you're trying to anticipate how your value chain will change. So the things that you're doing and providing to a user, you want to be making sure that there's going to be no competitor that comes out with something that's better. You can't predict that. You have no idea what competitor is going to be coming out with. That's very, very difficult to predict. But then as you go lower down the value chain, when you're using things where you're the customer for somebody else, then those things are a little bit easier to predict, because if they create something that is going to be more efficient, then you're going to embrace that and use that. But that's going to change the way that you actually provide services to your customers. So, for example, if you're doing something where you're providing, a basic example would be copywriting services. Well, suddenly you've got AI. Therefore, those people that you've probably trained and you've recruited and trained and developed, who are your copywriters, suddenly you have a challenge that perhaps you're going to be using AI, because there's suddenly going to be it's going to be a lot more efficient to actually start using AI than it is to use these people. So once you have a map, you can start to then say Wardley Mapping has these 30 economic models. I don't use all 30 of them because I think you go quite deeply into them. But if you just take some of the most basic ones, you can start to ask the questions such as, well, are we using anything on the market, or are we not using anything on the market which is more evolved, more efficient and cheaper than... And are we sticking to building something that we could just be buying? Or are we buying something that we could now be outsourcing? Are we keeping these copywriters when we could just be using AI? And so once you start to ask yourself 6 or 7 questions based on these economic models, where you're saying, well, let's look through our entire map. Is there anything that we're resisting using that we should be using? Then you start to say, well, why are we resisting that? And perhaps it's a very good reason. Perhaps our advantage is that these copywriters are well known on the market and people want to come to us because they are special for some reason, or maybe that's just inertia. So I think once you have the map and you can apply the climate patterns to it, you can start to not predict the future because it's unpredictable, but you can start to see that some things are going to change. And as those things change, what does that mean for us as an organization? Are we going to go with that change? Are we going to resist it? Are our competitors going to resist it? Should we be a first mover here? Should we be a fast follower there? It's quite difficult to explain without showing a map. It's like trying to describe a map of Beijing without actually showing the map of Beijing. But yeah, you can definitely take the current state and then roll things forward. And you're not predicting, you're not saying this is exactly what's going to happen, but you can start to anticipate because you know everything is moving towards the right-hand side of the map. And as things cross into across these boundaries, from, as I said, from customized things into products and from products into utility services, it changes the nature of your landscape, your value chain, and in your market quite dramatically.
I think there's a richness to this that probably doesn't lend itself to anything other than a map, as you've said. Mm-hmm. Without the visual, it's a challenge, and I'm okay with that with this conversation. I'd like to tease out something else, and I really don't want to head too much into a rabbit hole here, but it's a question about granularity. You talk about the value chain and the component parts and understanding needs and change. Is there a tendency for people to want to go too granular or not granular enough? Is there a sweet spot in granularity?
It's a good question. I think every client I've worked with wants to have a map of their entire organization. And I have a video on my site from the FSA who shared how they actually did that. And the map is horrendous. By their own admission, it's horrendous. Because there are that many moving parts in an organization. But once you then map it out and you think, okay, our map is horrendously chaotic, does that accurately represent what's going on inside the organization? The FSA said, well, yeah, that does actually represent what's going on. So the map is a shock, but it's not a surprise. So generally, I would say don't try to go and map your entire organization just because it's going to take you a long time and you're going to be left with something where you think, oh, how can I do anything with this? So for me, I think from trial and error and from working with lots of organizations on this is I would map out a need. That's the best way of doing it, because if you have multiple needs, you can combine them into a map, because needs are different, but as you go down the value chain, you end up with electricity, because everything runs on electricity at the end of the day. There's very few businesses that don't run on electricity or some kind of power source. So at the end of every value chain, for any kind of need, you're going to end up with a power source. And that just shows you that the further you go down the map, the more common the components are. So if you map different needs and you combine them together, you will find that it's like a palm tree. The trunk of it will be pretty much the same for all of them. It's just the thing at the top that matters. And it's the thing at the top that's important, because people aren't interested in the power source that you use. People aren't interested in the things behind the scenes. They're only interested in the things that they can see. So that's the thing to focus on for me, and that would be my advice. Anybody mapping is just start with one user need. And then in terms of granularity, I tend to tell people to stick to 10 components. If you're going beyond 10 components, you're going to start having something that's going to be a little bit difficult for people who are new to mapping to really understand what you're talking about. Generally speaking, though, you always stop when you're mapping when you come to a component that's beyond your control. So I don't want to give any particular examples because it might alienate people who don't know that example. But for any component that you're using, once you get to a point where it's kind of, well, we don't have any influence on that, stop there. Because what you're really interested in is the things that you do for the organization. So there's two parts of the map, really. If you think of the vertical, you've got the things that you're doing that are close to the customer where you should be doing the right thing. That's where you're trying to focus on being effective. You're trying to focus on differentiating yourselves from your competitors. But as you go down the map, you're using common components that everybody's using. Because here you're trying to be efficient. You're trying to do the thing right. Unfortunately, I think a lot of organizations get it the wrong way around. They try to do everywhere they try to do it right. And it's better, I think it's a Drucker, quote from, it's not Drucker, it's from Akov, who says that it's better to do the right thing wrong than to do the wrong thing right. If you're doing the right thing wrong, you will get better at it. And that's how you start to develop competitive advantage, because you're learning how to do it. But if you start just doing the wrong thing right, you get stuck into that. And people say, well, we shouldn't be doing that anymore. We need to evolve because the market's changing. And people say, well, we're very good at this. We're the best on the market. Are we really going to give up the advantages that we've developed over time? But that's a level of bravery that you require to turn around and say, okay, we're going to take a risk. We're going to open ourselves up and say, yeah, we're not great at this, but it's the right thing to do. And that's, how do you know what the right thing to do is? Well, is that what users need? Is that what they want? Is that going to delight them? And if it does, then you know you're on the right direction and you will learn how to do it better, because, and this is again what the Wardley map show you, you've only got to work out that top part of the map, because the bottom part of the map, you're still using pretty much the same systems that you're using for everything else. And most of these you can outsource because people don't care what kind of cloud provider that you've got, or you can buy these things as products because no one's seen them. It's just, why reinvent the wheel? You can just use something that somebody else has got. We really want to be focusing on satisfying users by doing the right thing. And that often means doing something new and doing something different. And that's where I think innovation comes into it, because you're trying something different. You're trying to find a way to satisfy a user desire that others haven't done. And that's where I think the advantage comes from. But of course, once you do that, others will copy you. And then what you're doing that's different and special will become standard and boring and just the table stakes. But that's where you want to get into that habit of being able to consistently find user needs that are being unmet and discovering ways of satisfying those better than others. And that's where it's not a one-off. And I think, again, that's a problem that a lot of organizations have. They think if we do this, we will succeed. And then that's us being successful forever. But it's not, because others will copy very quickly what you're doing. So then it has to become a practice of constantly doing this. And that's why, again, I think mapping is useful, because you're not just doing a map once and then saying, this is how we think it's going, and therefore that's our plan, and we just go ahead and do it. Because as you then do it, you can start to look at the map as you're going and then saying, well, are there other needs that are appearing? Are there other components that we could be using to do this even better? And you're also then tracking your own progress. We had these assumptions when we started this, but things aren't going the way that we want them to go. Perhaps some of our thinking originally was not there. And because you've got a map, you've got a physical visual of that landscape, you can then turn around and say, well, where were our assumptions wrong? And can we learn from that to make sure our assumptions next time are not going to be so flawed? And so then I think that's how you then start to develop this ability to adapt, because you're learning where your strengths and weaknesses in your thinking comes from, because you have that physical representation. You don't have a 70-slide PowerPoint presentation that you started the project with, because you probably didn't read that the first time. You're not going to want to read that 12 months later. But if you go back to your original map, you could see how your thinking was being shaped, because you can visually see it. And then you can compare that to reality and then say, okay, there was a miss. There was a gap between these two things. Essentially, you're doing a post-mortem now. There's a gap between these two things. What was wrong with our thinking? What do we need to do to make sure that we don't repeat those same kind of mistakes? And one of my favorite expressions, I'm not quite sure who came out with it, but it's in a more complex and changing world. If you're not a learning organization, you're going to be out-competed by one that is. And I think the maps allow you to learn at the time, because you're learning from each other, but over time as well, because you can compare reality to how you thought it was going to unfold to how it actually did.
I've got a quick question. Something that just dawned on me there as you were talking about learning organizations and that real-time reflection on the visual representation in the map. Presumably you can use these maps through a time series. You can do a map, you get let a period of time, you make some decisions, you can create a new map, you go back to your old map. What's the most number of maps that you've used with an organization in a time series?
Close to 100. But this was a reasonably complex organization. And they'd got to the stage where they were mapping needs. So it wouldn't be 100 needs, but it would be like 60 or 70 needs that they thought they were mapping. So there'd be needs of users, there'd be needs of shareholders, there'd be needs for employees, there were regulators in certain markets that they were in. So how many maps should you use? Well, the interesting thing is that when you actually create a map, and it happens to me all the time now, you create a map and you go and look at it even a couple of weeks later or a month later, especially if you look at it 6 months later. But even a couple of weeks later, you go back to the map and you look at it and you think, what the hell was I thinking when I wrote that? Well, I don't understand what I was thinking there. So you put notations on the map. So then you can go back and even start challenging your own maps a couple of weeks later, because if you've mapped something out, you've learned something. And then you've probably gone away and done something. And then you've gone back to that map and you're thinking that my thinking even 2 weeks ago was a little bit unsophisticated compared to how I am now. So the idea is not to get attached to the maps. They're a good artifact because you can then start, as I say, compare post-project to pre-project and where you got things wrong. But often you'll find that when you map things out, you're mapping something imperfectly because your understanding of the situation is also imperfect. You lack awareness of things. And the process of mapping gives you that awareness. So when you go back and look at something, you're thinking, okay, look, it's unsophisticated. My understanding 2 weeks ago was fairly unsophisticated. So you go back to the map, you completely change it again, and you say, okay, now we have a better map. And that better map reflects a better awareness of the situation. So I don't think it's the amount of maps that you need. As I said, I had an organization that I was working with that did up to around about 100 maps. And it meant that in any kind of meeting they went into, they could pull out a map and they could understand where they finished their last meeting because it was visually represented. And it then took them about 2 or 3 minutes to understand people who are in senior positions know that you're dealing with like a dozen different situations on a daily basis that are as diverse from each other as you can possibly imagine. And it takes you, 5 or 10 minutes to orientate yourself. I've just been having a deep discussion with the IT team around investments in our future architecture. And now I'm dealing with my finance manager's got tax issues that we need to deal with. And now I'm speaking to shareholders. They're very, very different contexts, and it can be disorientating if you're having to jump between them. For each one of these, if you can pull up a map and you can show you exactly where you left your thinking last time, the decisions that you made, even though the map might be terrible, you understand where you were thinking, and then you can pick up from where you've actually left off. So that's where having multiple maps is really valuable, because it just speeds up the meetings that you actually have. And when you make decisions in that meeting, instead of somebody sending minutes and nobody reading them, you make the changes on the map that reflects your current understanding of the situation. And you have that record for when you next discuss that thing. But it's also then you have that record when that team needs to go out and speak to somebody else about it. So you're always dealing off the same page, which makes it valuable. So I don't think it is the number. Having lots of maps is useful for that purpose, because you've got a way into any kind of situation. But you don't need to get attached to the maps. The real value is in how the maps increase your awareness and your ability to communicate as teams, and then to make decisions going forward. But they can, as I said, be useful for postmortems and pre-mortems as well, which is a quite a nice way of doing it. That once you put all the hard effort into creating a map, this is the project we're going to run, we believe in it, we get quite attached to it. And then, I think it's from Gary Klein, is it the pre-mortem idea? They used to turn around and say, well, okay, let's imagine now it's 6 months in the future. This project has definitely failed. 100%, it's gone wrong. So now we need to understand where the weaknesses are in this project. Now, again, if you've got this in a PowerPoint presentation, you're flicking through multiple pages, and that's very difficult to find. If you think you find something and it's your boss who's really pushed that particular idea, it might be difficult to turn around and say, look, the weakness is it's the boss's idea. But once you've got it on a map, because it's collectively created through a process of communication and challenge, it's nobody's map and it's everybody's map. Nobody's actually attached to it. It just reflects our current understanding of things. So when you look at things on a map and say, well, okay, where is the weakness here? Well, perhaps our assumption here, we're not quite sure whether that's correct. That was a bit of a guesswork from us. Or we know that this is another part of the map where we know something could happen and we're not sure what it is. And so then you can start to make decisions. Well, okay, the thing that we don't know is going to happen, we're going to set up some kind of sensing device. We're going to be monitoring the market for this and getting an early warning signal just to make sure that if it goes in a direction we don't want it to, we can react to it. And this assumption here that we've made, okay, that's where we're going to do a little bit more analysis. We're not going to analyze everything. We're going to analyze that one individual component, because these we think are the weaknesses in the map. So then you have that. I think it's extremely valuable then for a pre-mortem to anticipate where the weaknesses might be, so you can start to correct them. And again, it's all because you're depersonalizing challenge. You're not challenging somebody's ideas. You're not challenging somebody's pet project. You're not challenging your boss. You're challenging the map, and the map belongs to nobody. So nobody gets offended when you turn around and say, that's dumb, because as I said, you'll look at your own maps a couple of weeks later and you'll go, wow, that's really not what it should be. And you improve it and you improve your awareness. And that's how I think you start to move forward as an organization.
I think what really came out in the last part of the conversation there was how different this is to the traditional static strategy.
Let me open that a little bit here, because I think that's a really important point. It's I think most people are confused. I mean, strategy is one of those words like innovation and culture that everybody uses and everybody uses it differently. And that's where a lot of the problems actually come from. I may say strategy and think it's high level thinking, and you may say strategy and you think it's a plan. And therefore, I'm looking for you to have a plan and you're looking for me to have I'm looking for you to have high level thinking. You're looking for me to have a plan. And that's where the confusion comes from. But an awful lot of strategy is planning, and it's confused with planning. And you can't plan for things when you do not control the variables. If you're not in control of all the variables, it's pointless having a plan. And I think that's where a lot of organizations get to, is that we need a plan. Okay, if you were planning, let's say you plan for the next 2 years ahead. Okay, well, let's jump 2 years ago, January 2022. The world is significantly different from where it was in January 2022. Go back 2 years before that, January 2020. Again, significantly different from what it was from January 20 to January 2022. So how can you plan for a future where you do not control all the variables? And I think this approach is more about making moves. It's you make the next best move in front of you with the information that you've got. And then you observe how it's going. And if you need to adjust, you do. And I think it's that simple. It's not about having a plan to do one thing. It's about making multiple moves. And it's the sheer volume of moves and the intelligence of the moves that you're making, because you can make moves at different parts of your map. Here, we're going to outsource. There, we're going to build something. Here, we're going to invest in this, and there, we're going to divest. You're making moves right the way across the map. And you don't need, therefore, to have 6 months of planning to make a single decision, because a lot of these things just will seem natural and logical to you. And I think that's the approach, and that's very much the Eastern approach to strategy. It's not about trying to do one thing. It's about trying to do multiple things and seeing what works. And if it works, do more of that. If it doesn't work, stop doing that. It really is that simple at the end of the day. Of course, if you're doing huge investments, then you need a plan. But with huge investments, you probably have more control over the variables. If you're building a new stadium, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, but you can control the variables. But if you're in a competitive market where you don't know what technologies are going to come onto the market, you don't know what competitors are going to do, you don't know what the business cycle, you can generally predict a business cycle. If you can't predict and you're not in control of these things, then yeah, you shouldn't plan. And therefore, there's a different way of doing strategy out there that in a more volatile world, you have to approach it entirely differently, I would agree.
Yeah. And you allude there to the Eastern approach, and the subtext was that often in the West it is different. My experience is that most places have a static plan, a static strategic plan. Most often it's not looked at. I have a horrible test for the people that have created strategy, usually an exec. I give everybody in the business, or everybody can get access to, 3 Post-it notes. And then I say, write down from memory what you're currently taking from strategy that guides your decision-making day by day. So on this take of strategy, I've taken a number of points from today. I think we ended there with very much on the adaptive approach to strategy, of constantly checking in. I think I took away the importance of always tying back to the user needs, and the importance of the value chain in the construction. I took away the adaptive nature of this over whatever time frame, and I like this idea that you could be looking at things over weeks or maybe months and looking back and saying, hey, what was my thinking there? How does this inform where I am today? What can I learn from this? And interestingly, I connected back to the original metaphor and the original stories of your early life as a traveler. Wanting to travel, you're an entrepreneur to fund the lifestyle you want. And I think that very much relates to maps and this process of mapping, and how this can be used as a communication tool, both for the notion of traveling, of journey, of adaptation. So that's my kind of summary of some of the things I've taken. I'd like to leave with a couple of questions for you. This is a broad one now, and it can be anything at all. From your experience of what you've learned using Wardley maps in so many organizations. If you could now direct people's attention to what you've discovered by using this approach, what would it be? And it could be anything at all.
Yeah, it would be the principles that the mapping method is built on. I think it's undervalued within the Wardley maps community. I don't think it's ignored, but I don't think people realize the value that's there. I've worked with a partner, is a guy from Wales who also lives outside of Britain. And when he first saw the principles, he went, "Well, these are just common sense." I thought, well, yeah, they're common sense, but they're in 4 phases. In the first phase, yes, it's their basic common sense. Know who your users are. Focus on user needs. Have a common language, so you can challenge assumptions and understand what's being considered. Use appropriate methods. Remove bias and duplication. Yeah, these are all common sense. They're not that common in organizations. We know that, but still common sense. Phase 2, a little bit more sophisticated. Manage failure, manage inertia. Think aptitude and attitude is what we spoke about earlier. It's not IT people are homogenous. There are different types of IT people who'd like to have different problem-solving skills. Then you get into phase 3 of these principles, and then they start to become quite sophisticated. And phase 4 is they're very sophisticated. And I think when my approach to mapping has been to train people in mapping for strategic purposes. And it's difficult because not everybody, strategy is really at the level of the senior people in an organization. If you're a senior people, I've got some friends who are very senior in their organizations. They're not interested in learning anything new because they're already successful and they're too busy applying what they've learned to run and manage their organizations. So who really wants to learn strategy? Well, often it's going to be kind of heads of departments who want to get ahead, and that's who we work with mainly. But at the end of the day, that's not enough. At the end of the day, we really want to have people across an organization. I think that in collective intelligence being brought online, because in a more complex world, that's what's the old expression that all bugs are shallow with enough eyeballs. You really do need to be expanding your ability to observe and to bring people's intelligence online, because ideas can come from anywhere in the organization. Recognizing where the mistakes are can come from anyone in the organization and will need to come from anybody within the organization. So I think what we're focusing on this year is a way of being able to train organizations to adopt these principles. Because within these principles, you get mapping anyway. Like use the common language is the first principle. And that common language is map. Understand your user, create a value chain, put the evolution axis on, and now you can start making decisions about build, buy, or outsource, which is one of the a big challenge in organizations. Once you've done this, it takes you about an hour, you can answer that question instantly. Of course, you want to have a discussion. So maybe there's a strategic reason why we're building this instead of outsourcing it. But generally, you can turn around and say, if something is well evolved, you would outsource it. Why would you need to build it? And then you're challenging people to turn around and give you reasons why they are not doing things that are logical. But there are other things within the principles that then start to take it further, that start to how you structure yourself, how you lead, how you learn as an organization, because these principles are built around these 6 categories. How your communication, your operations, how you develop, how you learn, lead, and how you're structured. And so we have a program that takes people through, it's a 12-month program. So it's instead of taking people out of their workplace, putting them in a false environment, an artificial environment, teaching them best practices and expecting them to go back and apply what they've learned. We have workbooks which we take into an organization, we release at the beginning of the month, and we say, you figure out how to go through these exercises this month. And at the end of the month, there's a particular outcome where you come together, and as an organization, these are concrete steps that help you move forward. Like the first one is that you understand who your users are. The second one is that you understand what your users need. And I think if anybody's really looking into Wardley maps, don't be distracted by the map itself. It's an extremely valuable tool, but it's a tool. The real value in the entire mapping method, and I think the work of Simon Wardley, it's close to genius if it's not genius. It holds together really well. The deeper you go into it, it fits together. But the principles is where the real value is. And if an organization can adopt these principles, these basic skills and habits, these good ways of operating, and I've seen it with an organization that we've been running this, we've been piloting this with, it's quite dramatic, because you're giving people guidance on things that really doesn't exist in organizations. Because I think a lot of organizations, they overcomplicate things. They do things not because they work, they do things because it's sexy, or because it's modern, or because the highest paid person's opinion say this is what we should be doing. And I think we really do need to be unlocking people's potential. We do really need to be creating conditions in which people can actually show the best of themselves. And that's about improving the interactions in an organization, giving people awareness of what's really going on around them, and giving them these principles which will enable them to adapt quicker, because they said they can communicate more effectively. They're developing the right types of skills. So I think the main takeaway is look at the principles. I'm pushing what I do here, but we have a series of videos on my website introducing the first 9 of these principles. And yeah, they're basic, but they are quite revolutionary when you actually start to focus on user needs, because most organizations don't. They're focused on their own needs. And I love this expression from Lao Tzu, where he says that to win the empire, you must govern the state by being straightforward, but wage war by being crafty. So in a business sense, this is to win, you need to have an organization that's easy to run, but make moves that your rivals can't respond to. But I think most organizations have got that reversed. They wage war internally for power and for influence, and they're so exhausted that by the time they go to market, all they do is just copy everybody else. It's a copycat product, or you're just following best practice. And we really need to flip that around. And it's about simplifying the organization, putting basic principles in place that people can follow, that enables them to communicate better, to have more awareness, to come out with better ideas, to be able to communicate these in an effective way that doesn't involve extremely long meetings where nothing happens, and things can more quickly get done. So when you go to market, you can go to market with far more innovative ideas and far stronger competitive ways of acting. So, the power politics, your competitors are the ones outside your office. They're the other organizations. It's not the people in the next department to you. And I think the principles are a way of overcoming that, and overcoming that quite dramatically and quite radically. And so that would be the main takeaway. If anybody's looking at Wardley Maps, is really start with the principles.
And obviously, you apply this with all the organizations. You've applied this with yourself and your own business. And we began by this exploration of your early days as an entrepreneur, and then into travel, into a talent pipeline. What's next for you? What's next for Marcus?
Well, I think we're really going to be pushing the principles and adaptive leadership program. I think that's something. Well, I spoke earlier about needing to productize. Wardley Maps is a great method, and it needs to become productized in order for people to be able to, like yourself, not to look and say, well, I looked at it, I don't really get it. It needs to be in a way that it kind of crosses the chasm. People can say, okay, we understand how to actually use it. So we continue to work on that. I continue to be writing a book, which I now realize is not 1 book, but 6 books. So the second book of those 6 should be ready come spring, although that's a deadline that could drift a little bit. But I think we are going through monumental changes. And those competitive, it's going to be a far more competitive world. We have more competitors coming online. We have radical technologies. But ultimately, it's about people. I think John Boyd's famous expression is people, ideas, technology, in that order. And I think it's the relationship between humans and technology. And there's a lot of great technology people out there. I'm really focused on that human side. But it's not humans as, of course, being emotionally intelligent is important. Mental health is important. All of these things are important, but it's also most important about how people interact with each other. And it's the interactions that I'm interested in, how they interact with each other, how they interact with technology, and how they interact with the wider conditions around them. So it's about writing the book, because the book is, for me, I think more than anybody else. I do publish it on Medium, but it's about organizing my thoughts. It's about developing my thinking. And then that helps me understand how I need to productize Wardley maps, because I do think it's revolutionary. I do think it's one of the most valuable tools that I've come across in the decades that I've now been in work. So it's about being evangelical for that approach, I think, because there are some very basic ideas within there that if organizations adopted them, I think they would find a radical improvement. And we've spoken about one at length, focus on user needs, but it's also about having a common language that people can challenge assumptions and learn what's really going on. So it's more of that. I think it's more of that. And then getting back to travel, once the world is opening up to itself again, because it seems to be closing in on itself a little bit at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. Thank you for today. And I think you've given me lots to think about for myself, actually. I think the first thing I'll be doing is trying to understand some of the principles. And I've already got a bit of an image in my mind of a bit of a map for some of the things that I'd like to do into 2024 and 2025. So thanks very much for that. Fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Ian.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.